friends. This is Luke with the Yoga School. In this module, we're going to be discussing injuries. So the foundation of preventing injuries is good common sense, an understanding of anatomy, and not forcing your students into postures that they're not physically ready for. We're going to take care of anatomy in a different module, but I want to open up a discussion about injuries and some of the subtle ways that you can be a leader in helping your students prevent injuries. Specifically, let's think about how yoga philosophy works. Everything manifests from the unmanifested into the manifested world, into the physical reality. So if we think about this psychologically, then we think that the subconscious, the conscious mind, are all gateways into the physical world. So if we think about it this way, an injury is a manifestation of some kind of thought pattern. It's pretty obvious that injuries are violent, so these are himsa with the body. But treating injuries as a standalone issue without addressing the backdrop of them is kind of akin to dealing with a symptom of something without addressing the actual cause of it. So once a student has an injury, there's really not a lot to do but to deal with it in the physical to get it to subside. But the real goal that we should have is to prevent injuries by not fostering an atmosphere where students are encouraged to push themselves to the point of injury. This is really, really difficult. I want to say too that it's not your responsibility if a student gets injured. Even if a student comes into your yoga class, your job is to do your very best. If you do your very best, even if you're giving adjustments, eventually or once in a while a student's going to get injured. Sometimes people say, I've never had an injury. Some teachers say, I've never had an injured student. That's fine and that's wonderful. But I'm speaking in generalities that this is just the way that bodies are. Athletes get injured, tennis players get injured, people that go to the gym get injured, even swimmers get injured. Human bodies are designed to get injured and repair themselves. That's what they do. As a yoga teacher, sometimes you can be under pressure to not have injured students, but I want you to just do the very best that you can and kind of consider some of these ideas. So, first and foremost, the designers of yoga, the old sages of Hatha Yoga, did not intend yoga to be practiced in a group setting. It was one-on-one instruction. Yoga is a very individualized, very independent practice. The concept of Purusha, the goal as it were for a lot of yoga practices, is an individual self, a cosmic being that is independent and eternal. So naturally, it's a little bit of a sort of oxymoron to put people in a group setting and tell them to try to pursue yoga. It doesn't really make much sense. Furthermore, it takes a great deal of discipline to work independently in that group setting without fostering some kind of negative feelings about yourself or spurring your ego, identity, or other emotions that tend to create violence and injury. So here's some things that I recommend first and foremost when it comes to injuries. Be real with your students about your own injuries. If you've never had injuries, that's cool. Don't drive it down your student's throat and don't say like, hey, I've never been injured. That's like saying, hey, I'm so perfect, don't you want to be like me? That's going to create more problems than you realize. The best thing to do is just be honest and say, hey, this is the path that I've had, these are the mistakes that I've made. The process of yoga, as I learned it, was not a process of not making mistakes. It was a process of learning and being unattached to the results of your efforts and to just come about it fresh every day. So please foster that with your students. So also, if you've had injuries, I've had injuries, most teachers have had injuries, you don't need to stop your student in the middle of class and start talking about yourself, but you can just be honest. If a student comes to you, according to the Yoga Sutras, there's 3 means of evaluation: experience, inference, and scripture. So use those. Use your own experience. Say, this worked for me, this was my experience. Use inference. Say, you know what, here's the data set. This is how many students I've taught. This is what's worked for the students that remind me most of your situation. And then use scripture. Use your anatomy courses. Use your textbooks. And use knowledge bases that are out there. Just be practical about it. Also, don't clap for your students. If a student performs an asana, it has nothing to do with the rest of the students in the class. If one of your students is performing a handstand and they nail it and they hold it for 10 seconds or a minute or whatever, that doesn't have anything to do with anybody else. And not only that, it's really not even something that they themselves need to be proud of if they're practicing yoga. Because the purposes of yoga are not physical. I understand that it's an ego boost, it's confidence, it's inspiring, you get endorphins, it feels great to do postures that have been challenging for you. And I'm not devaluing or discounting the triumph that's involved in that. But making that a social thing creates expectations for the other people in the group, and then they participate in what's called reflected appraisal, which means that their sense of self, their sense of confidence is based on how they perceive other people perceiving them. So if they look at somebody doing a handstand and they feel positive about that, then they have an expectation of themselves, and if they don't meet that, it might be even subconscious. This is not healthy for them. So I think just creating a situation and an environment within your yoga studio, within your class, so that your students are allowed to practice in whatever condition that they're in. I think that's a really important thing. When it comes to injuries in class, it's commonly connected to liability. That's covered in a different module, but do be aware that whatever it says in your waiver, whatever it says on your website, is how you have to behave in your class. Traditional Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga, of course, was taught by people from India, and they didn't really know English, and it was all in Sanskrit. So physical adjustments are very normal in Ashtanga yoga. However, in other practices, and especially as time moves forward, and especially amidst the COVID pandemic, if there's something that was taught there, is that the verbal adjustments, even non-verbal subtle adjustments, you could even make motioning adjustments. You can do adaptations of a posture by just simply handing someone a prop. So the way that you want to teach, whatever resources that you want to use should be made clear in either your bio, your class description, in your waiver as people walk into the door, or what have you. So that's another thing about it. So 2 aspects of injuries. Number 1, understand that they start before the physical practice. Don't be machinist mind with the human being. If they're having a problem in the physical realm, there's something else going on. We're yoga teachers, okay? So we know that if somebody has a chronic injury, there's something else behind that. Okay, and then secondly, fostering an environment where they don't feel pressure to assign themselves any expectations or competition with the group around them, and that people can just work at their own pace and be somewhat oblivious to people around them. And the very worst part of this is when students are competing with their teachers. We certainly don't want that. Haribol. Om.